In a modest suburban home in Richmond, Virginia, a 67-year-old retired librarian was about to face the unthinkable betrayal from someone she trusted most. What started as welcoming her unemployed son back home took a shocking turn when she discovered her life support had been deliberately unplugged. Mary Feldington wasn't your typical COPD patient. For 3 years, she had managed her oxygen dependency with fierce independence and dignity. When security cameras captured her son David, systematically disconnecting her life-sustaining equipment to power his gaming setup, she realized her maternal love had nearly cost her everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Mary Feldington stood at her living room window, watching the blue Honda Civic navigate the potholes in her driveway, with the careful precision of someone who knew every crack and crevice by heart. The familiar sight should have brought comfort, but instead, a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. She adjusted the nasal cannula that fed precious oxygen into her lungs, the gentle hiss of the concentrator beside her, serving as a constant reminder of her fragility. The car door slammed shut with unnecessary force, and David emerged, her 34-year-old son who still moved with the restless energy of someone half his age. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set in that stubborn line she remembered from his teenage years. Behind him, the trunk yawned open, revealing a chaos of cardboard boxes, computer towers and tangled cables. "It's just temporary, Mom," he'd said over the phone 3 weeks ago, his voice carrying that particular strain that meant he was fighting back emotions he didn't want to acknowledge. "Just until I get back on my feet. A few months, tops." Mary had wanted to say no. The words had formed on her tongue, along with all the reasonable objections. Her health, her carefully managed routine, the fact that David's version of "a few months" had historically stretched into years. But the desperation beneath his casual tone had undone her, the way it always did. Despite everything, despite the years of broken promises and disappointed expectations, he was still her little boy asking for help. Now, watching him haul the first box up the familiar brick steps, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. "David, honey," she called through the screen door, her voice slightly breathless from the effort of walking to greet him. "Let me help you with—" "I've got it, Mom." He didn't look at her as he maneuvered past, the box labeled "gaming rig fragile" in his distinctive scrawl. "Just point me toward my old room." The dismissal stung more than it should have. Mary followed him down the narrow hallway, her oxygen concentrator's 20-foot cord, limiting her range, but allowing her to witness his first survey of the space that had once been his childhood sanctuary. The room looked smaller now, somehow, with its pale blue walls and the twin bed that seemed inadequate for a grown man. David set the box down with exaggerated care, already scanning the walls for outlets. "I'll need to run some extension cords," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "And I'll probably need to upgrade your internet. This old router isn't going to cut it for streaming." "Streaming?" Mary asked, genuinely confused. For the first time since his arrival, David looked directly at her, and she was startled by how much older he looked. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during his last visit at Christmas, and his skin had the pale, slightly gray cast of someone who spent too much time indoors. "Gaming streams, Mom. Never mind, it's work stuff." Mary wanted to ask more, but David was already heading back outside for another box. She remained in the doorway, watching him transform his childhood bedroom into something foreign and alien. Each trip brought more equipment, monitors that seemed impossibly large, keyboards that glowed with neon lights, speakers that looked capable of rattling the windows. "Where's your suitcase?" she asked when he paused to catch his breath. "Suitcase? Your clothes? Personal things?" David gestured vaguely toward a worn duffel bag sitting by the front door. "That's it." The ratio troubled her. 20 boxes of electronics to 1 bag of clothing. It spoke to priorities she didn't understand. A life reduced to its most essential elements, and apparently, those elements were all electronic. As the afternoon wore on, Mary attempted to share the rhythms of her daily routine. She showed him where she kept her medications, explained the schedule Dr. Wright had insisted upon, oxygen therapy for at least 16 hours a day, careful monitoring of her oxygen levels, the importance of avoiding stress and overexertion. "The concentrator needs to stay plugged in," she explained, patting the white machine that had become her constant companion. "It doesn't hold a charge like a phone." If it gets unplugged. Yeah, Mom, I get it. You need the oxygen thing. Got it. David was on his hands and knees, threading cables under furniture with the focused intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle. This is serious medical equipment. Very important. Message received. The casual dismissal of her life-sustaining machine as the oxygen thing sent a chill through Mary that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the old windows. But she pushed down her irritation, telling herself he was just overwhelmed by the move, stressed about his job situation. I usually have dinner around 6, she continued. Nothing fancy. I don't have much of an appetite these days, but you're welcome to join me. We could catch up properly. Thanks, but I'll probably just order something later. I want to get my setup running tonight. By 8 o'clock, David's room had been transformed into something that looked more like a NASA mission control center than a bedroom. 3 monitors formed a semicircle around an expensive-looking chair, their screens casting an eerie blue glow that seemed to pulse with electronic life. The twin bed had been pushed against the wall to make room for the elaborate configuration, and every available outlet hosted a power strip bristling with cords. Mary made herself a simple dinner of soup and toast, eating alone at the kitchen table where she could hear the first sounds of David's work, rapid-fire clicking, occasional muttered curses, and what sounded like explosions coming from his speakers. The noise was punctuated by David's voice, talking to people she couldn't see, using language that made her grateful she couldn't quite make out the words. By 10 o'clock, she'd given up on the idea of a quiet evening together. By midnight, she was lying in bed with her oxygen concentrator humming beside her, listening to David's increasingly animated conversations with his invisible gaming partners. The walls in the old house were thin, and she could hear every exclamation, every burst of triumphant laughter, every string of profanity when something didn't go his way. At 2 a.m., she got up to use the bathroom and noticed the glow still emanating from under David's door, along with the constant chatter and electronic noise. At 4 a.m., she was awakened by what sounded like David shouting at someone about a camping noob and something being totally rigged. When Mary finally drifted off to sleep near dawn, it was with the unsettling realization that her son, her little boy who used to read himself to sleep with library books and wake up early to help her with breakfast, had become a stranger who lived by the rhythms of a digital world she didn't understand. The next morning, she found David asleep in his gaming chair, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, one hand still resting on his mouse. Empty energy drink cans and food delivery containers littered the desk around his keyboards. The monitors displayed a frozen game scene featuring armored soldiers and what appeared to be a post-apocalyptic landscape. Mary stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying her son's face in the harsh light of the monitors. Even in sleep he looked tense, his brow furrowed as if he were fighting battles in his dreams too. This wasn't the temporary arrangement she'd imagined when she'd agreed to let him come home. This was something else entirely. Something that made her oxygen concentrator's steady rhythm feel suddenly more precious, more fragile than ever before. As she quietly closed his door and returned to her own morning routine, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just witnessed something that went far beyond a son in need of temporary shelter. The electric bill sitting on her kitchen counter, already showing a significant spike after just 1 week, seemed like the least of her worries. The real cost of David's homecoming, she was beginning to suspect, would be measured in more than just kilowatts and dollars. But like everything else about her son's new reality, the true price remained hidden behind closed doors and glowing screens. As mysterious and troubling as the digital world that had consumed him completely. The digital world that had consumed David completely showed no signs of releasing its grip as the days blurred into weeks. Mary's carefully orchestrated routine, medications at 8, breakfast at 9, oxygen therapy breaks every few hours, had been shattered by the constant electronic cacophony emanating from David's room. What she'd initially dismissed as adjustment period behavior had crystallized into an unrelenting pattern that left her feeling like a stranger in her own home. 2 weeks after his arrival, Mary sat at her kitchen table reviewing the electric bill that had arrived that morning, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she tried to make sense of the numbers. The figure at the bottom made her gasp so sharply that her oxygen saturation monitor began beeping an alarm. 40% increase. In 2 weeks. David? She called, her voice carrying down the hallway. No response came from behind his closed door, though she could hear the familiar sounds of electronic warfare and his increasingly agitated commentary to unseen teammates. She knocked gently, then more firmly when he didn't answer. David, honey, I need to talk to you about. The door swung open abruptly, revealing her son in the same clothes he'd worn for the past 3 days. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the telltale redness of someone who stared at screens far too long, and his hair stuck up at odd angles. The smell that wafted from his room, stale food, energy drinks, and unwashed laundry, made Mary take an involuntary step backward. What? His tone carried an edge of irritation that reminded Mary uncomfortably of his teenage years, but sharper somehow, more desperate. The electric bill came today. David, it's... She held up the paper with trembling fingers. It's nearly double what I usually pay. David glanced at the bill with the same dismissive expression he'd worn when she tried to explain her medical equipment. I'll get you the money when my unemployment comes through. It's not that big a deal, Mom. But David, I'm on a fixed income. I can't afford. I said I'll handle it. He was already turning back toward his room, toward the glow of his monitors and the digital world that seemed to matter more than anything in the physical realm. I'm in the middle of a raid. Can we talk about this later? The door closed with a finality that left Mary standing alone in the hallway, the bill still clutched in her hands. Through the thin walls, she could hear David's voice rising in frustration as he berated someone about their garbage DPS and threatened to kick them from the guild. That afternoon brought Mary's first severe breathing episode since David's arrival. She was attempting to vacuum the living room, a task that had become increasingly difficult, but which she insisted on doing herself, when the familiar tightness began creeping across her chest. The sensation started subtly, like a band slowly tightening around her ribs, but quickly escalated to the crushing feeling that her lungs were forgetting how to expand. She dropped the vacuum handle and fumbled for her pulse oximeter, the small device that had become as essential as her wedding ring. The reading made her stomach lurch, 82%. Dr. Wright had been very clear that anything below 90 was dangerous, below 85 was a medical emergency. David? She called, her voice weak and breathless as she made her way to her bedroom where the oxygen concentrator waited. David, I need help. The electronic cacophony from his room continued unabated. Either he couldn't hear her over his headphones or he was choosing not to respond. Mary collapsed into the chair beside her oxygen concentrator, increasing the flow rate and trying to remember the breathing exercises Dr. Wright had taught her. In through the nose, hold for 4 counts, out through pursed lips. 20 minutes later, when her oxygen levels had finally crept back above 90, and her heart rate had slowed from its panicked sprint, she heard David's door open. His footsteps padded to the kitchen, followed by the sounds of him rummaging through cabinets and the microwave humming to life. He never checked on her. Never asked if she was okay. The realization hit her harder than the breathing episode itself. The next morning brought Sarah Chin's regular Tuesday visit, a routine that had become one of Mary's few remaining lifelines to normalcy. Sarah arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, carrying her usual offering of fresh coffee and homemade muffins, her nurse's keen eyes immediately noting the shadows under Mary's eyes and the way she moved more slowly than usual. Rough night? Sarah asked, settling into the kitchen chair across from Mary and automatically checking the older woman's color and breathing pattern with professional discretion. David's been adjusting, Mary said carefully, loyalty to her son warring with her desperate need to confide in someone. It's taking some time for us to find our rhythm. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Mary caught the way her friend's gaze lingered on the empty energy drink cans visible through David's open doorway, the pizza boxes stacked by the front door, the general air of disruption that had settled over the house like dust. How much sleep are you getting? Sarah asked quietly. Before Mary could answer, a sudden explosion of sound erupted from David's room. Shouting, the crash of something being thrown, and a string of profanity so vile that both women winced. The outburst was followed by David's voice, raised to a level that made the thin walls vibrate. Are you kidding me? Are you fricking kidding me right now? That was a perfect headshot. This game is rigged. This is complete garbage. The tirade continued for several minutes, David's voice cracking with a kind of desperate fury that made Mary's chest tighten with something deeper than her usual breathing difficulties. This wasn't frustration or disappointment. This was the sound of someone genuinely unraveling. Sarah's coffee cup settled onto its saucer with a soft clink. Mary, she said carefully, how long has this been going on? He lost his job, you know. He's under a lot of stress. Mary. Sarah's voice carried the gentle firmness she used with patients who were avoiding difficult truths. This isn't normal stress response. How many hours a day is he gaming? Mary found herself calculating, really thinking about it for the first time. David was usually asleep when she woke up around 7. his room finally quiet after what she'd assumed were late nights. But now she realized the silence didn't come until dawn, sometimes later, and by the time she had her afternoon medication, the electronic noise had resumed. 12 hours, she said quietly. Maybe 14, maybe more. Every day? Every day since he arrived. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her expression troubled. Mary, that's not... That level of gaming, especially combined with the anger outbursts, the isolation. Has he been looking for work? The question hung in the air between them, and Mary realized she didn't actually know the answer. David spoke vaguely about applications and networking, but she'd never seen him dressed for an interview, never heard him on phone calls with potential employers, never seen any indication that job searching was occupying any portion of his marathon gaming sessions. He says he mentioned interviews. Mary's voice trailed off as she recognized the weakness of her own defense. Another crash came from David's room, followed by what sounded like a chair being kicked across the floor. Both women flinched, and Mary saw something shift in Sarah's expression, the professional mask of a healthcare worker who had just identified a serious problem. Mary, Sarah said gently, I think we need to talk about what's really happening here. And I think you need to consider that David might need more help than you can provide. As if summoned by their conversation, David's door opened and he emerged, wild-haired and wearing the same wrinkled shirt he'd had on for 3 days. He moved past them without acknowledgement, heading straight for the refrigerator where he grabbed an energy drink and a leftover slice of pizza. Morning, David, Sarah said pleasantly. I'm Sarah, your mom's neighbor. We haven't officially met. David glanced at her with the vague, unfocused look of someone whose mind was still partially engaged with digital realms. Yeah. Hi. He turned to Mary. Mom, the internet's been laggy. We need to upgrade to a better package. And I'm going to need you to order more energy drinks. I'm almost out. David, we need to talk about the electric bill. Later, Mom. I've got a tournament starting in 20 minutes. Prize pool is $2,000. This could solve all our money problems. He disappeared back into his room, leaving Mary and Sarah staring at each other across the kitchen table. In the silence that followed, broken only by the gentle hiss of Mary's oxygen concentrator and the resumption of electronic noise from David's room, both women recognized that they were looking at something far more serious than temporary unemployment stress. They were looking at an addiction that was consuming not just David but everyone around him, and Mary, with her fragile health and limited resources, was directly in its path. The addiction that was consuming David completely had begun to manifest in ways that made Mary's carefully managed world feel increasingly unstable. 3 weeks into his stay, she found herself scheduling an appointment with Dr. Wright after her oxygen saturation readings had been consistently lower than normal, her sleep disrupted not just by David's gaming noise, but by a growing sense of anxiety that seemed to squeeze her chest tighter than her COPD ever had. Dr. Wright's office felt like a sanctuary of calm professionalism after the chaos that had overtaken her home. The familiar smell of antiseptic and the gentle hum of medical equipment reminded Mary of a world where problems had solutions, where symptoms led to diagnoses and treatments. She settled into the examination chair, the portable oxygen tank she'd brought along hissing softly beside her. Your levels are concerning, Mary, Dr. Wright said, reviewing her chart with the methodical precision that had made him her trusted physician for 3 years. His salt and pepper beard couldn't hide the deepening lines of worry around his eyes as he studied the data. Your oxygen saturation has dropped consistently over the past month. More importantly, your stress indicators are through the roof. Mary fidgeted with the hem of her cardigan, reluctant to admit that her son's presence was literally making it harder for her to breathe. I've had some changes at home. My son moved back in temporarily. Changes can be stressful, but Mary, this level of physiological response suggests something more significant. Dr. Wright set down her chart and leaned forward, his tone carrying the gentle authority of someone who had seen too many patients minimize serious symptoms. COPD patients can't afford prolonged stress. Your lungs are already working at capacity. Additional stressors don't just affect your comfort. They can be life-threatening. The words hung in the air between them, more frightening than Mary wanted to acknowledge. She'd spent 3 years learning to live with her diagnosis, accepting the gradual loss of independence, the careful management of energy and resources. But the idea that her home environment, her sanctuary, could actually be killing her was almost too much to process. "What do you recommend?" she asked quietly. "Stress reduction is critical. Remove or minimize whatever factors are disrupting your routine." "And Mary?" Dr. Wright's expression grew even more serious. "Your oxygen concentrator is not optional equipment. It's life support. Anyone in your household needs to understand that interrupting your therapy, even briefly, could have fatal consequences." That evening, Mary returned home to find David's setup had somehow expanded beyond his bedroom. Extension cords snaked through the hallway like electronic ivy, leading to a second monitor he'd set up in the living room. "For streaming," he explained when she asked. The coffee table where she used to keep her medical journals and crossword puzzles now hosted a tangle of keyboards, controllers, and what appeared to be professional lighting equipment. "David, honey, we need to talk about the electrical situation," Mary began, still shaken by Dr. Wright's warnings. "The doctor said my equipment needs dedicated." "Mom, I'm about to start a 12-hour stream. Can this wait?" David was already settling into what had apparently become his secondary gaming station. His attention focused entirely on calibrating his equipment. This sponsor opportunity could be huge. "We're talking real money here." "But the extension cords are running through." "I said I'll deal with it later." His dismissal was sharper than usual, edged with the desperate irritability of someone whose digital world was being threatened by physical reality concerns. Mary retreated to her bedroom, noting with growing unease that several of her own appliances, the humidifier that helped her breathing, the small refrigerator where she kept her medications, had been unplugged to make room for David's expanding electronics empire. She quietly restored power to her medical equipment, making mental notes about outlet locations and power draws. That night brought the first of what Mary would later recognize as warning signs that should have prompted immediate action. She was awakened at 3 a.m. by the house plunging into darkness. Not a neighborhood outage, but something isolated to their home. The sudden silence of her oxygen concentrator sent panic shooting through her chest as she fumbled for her emergency portable tank in the dark. By the time she'd managed to locate a flashlight and investigate, she found David in the basement, muttering curses as he flipped circuit breakers with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly done this before. "What happened?" Mary asked, her voice shaky from both the breathing difficulties and the terror of being cut off from her life support without warning. "Overloaded the circuit," David said without looking at her. "Had 3 computers running, plus the streaming setup. I'll just redistribute the load." "David, the oxygen concentrator has to stay on," Dr. Wright said. "Yeah, Mom, I know it's important. I'm not stupid." But even as he spoke, Mary could see him calculating electrical loads, planning configurations that prioritized his equipment over her medical needs. The next few days brought a series of small power outages and electrical hiccups that David dismissed as quote, temporary issues, while he optimized the power distribution. Mary began keeping her portable oxygen tank closer, checking its charge levels obsessively, and sleeping fitfully as she listened for any interruption in the steady hum of her concentrator. It was during one of these restless nights that Mary first heard David talking to himself in ways that went beyond gaming commentary. Through the thin walls, she caught fragments of conversations that seemed one-sided even by the standards of online gaming. Urgent, pleading discussions about money, about debts, about just one more chance to make things right. When Sarah arrived for their Thursday visit, she immediately noticed the extension cords, the displaced medical equipment, and Mary's increasingly fragile appearance. "Mary, what's going on with the power situation?" Sarah asked, her nurse's training evident in the way she automatically checked that Mary's equipment was functioning properly. "David's been adjusting the electrical setup for his work." Sarah followed one of the extension cords with her eyes, noting how it snaked past Mary's oxygen concentrator, how several outlets that had once served medical equipment now bristled with gaming peripherals. "This isn't safe, Mary. Medical equipment needs dedicated circuits. If something trips a breaker while you're sleeping..." The unfinished sentence hung between them, heavy with implications Mary had been trying not to consider. "I've been thinking about the security cameras," Sarah continued carefully. "The ones you had installed after the break-ins. Are they still working?" Mary nodded, though she realized she hadn't checked the system since David's arrival. The cameras had been her response to feeling vulnerable after a series of neighborhood burglaries, a way to feel more secure in her own home. Now she wondered what they might reveal about the nocturnal activities that were disrupting her sleep and her household's electrical stability. "Would you like me to help you review the footage?" Sarah asked. "Just to see what's happening at night?" You mentioned the power issues have been when you're asleep. Together, they made their way to Mary's small home office where the security system's monitor sat dusty and neglected. As Sarah helped her navigate the unfamiliar interface, Mary felt a growing sense of unease. The cameras had been meant to protect her from external threats. She'd never imagined needing protection from the dangers that might emerge from within her own family. "Let's start with last night," Sarah suggested, her fingers moving efficiently across the controls. "Around the time you said the power went out." The grainy black and white footage began to play, showing the familiar layout of Mary's home in the infrared glow of night vision. At first, everything appeared normal. Mary asleep in her bed, the steady glow of her medical equipment, the quiet house settled into its nighttime rhythms. Then David appeared on screen, moving through the house with the furtive confidence of someone who believed himself unobserved. The footage showed him systematically unplugging various appliances, not just to add his own equipment, but rearranging the entire electrical ecosystem of the house to serve his digital obsessions. Mary watched in horrified fascination as her son moved past her bedroom door, past her sleeping form, past the oxygen concentrator that kept her alive, making calculations and adjustments that treated her life support as just another appliance competing for limited resources. "Mary," Sarah said quietly, her voice tight with professional concern, "I think we need to keep watching. And I think you need to start documenting what's happening here." As they scrolled through more footage, a pattern emerged that made Mary's chest tighten with something deeper than her usual breathing difficulties. David wasn't just using excessive power. He was systematically prioritizing his electronic needs over her medical requirements, treating her life-sustaining equipment as obstacles to be managed rather than necessities to be protected. The security cameras, installed to make her feel safer, were revealing that the greatest threat to her well-being was sleeping just down the hall, lost in digital worlds where power outlets mattered more than the mother whose life depended on them. The security cameras that had revealed David's nighttime activities had become Mary's window into a world she was only beginning to understand, a world where her life-sustaining equipment was nothing more than an obstacle to be managed. But nothing in the previous footage had prepared her for what she would discover on a gray Thursday morning that would shatter whatever remained of her maternal illusions. Mary woke feeling different, not just tired but fundamentally wrong, as if her body had been fighting a battle while she slept. Her head felt heavy, clouded in a way that reminded her of the early days after her COPD diagnosis, when she'd still been learning to recognize the signs of oxygen deprivation. She reached automatically for her pulse oximeter, the small device that had become as essential as checking the time. The reading made her stomach lurch. 78%. 78% was crisis territory. 78% was the kind of number that sent COPD patients to emergency rooms, that triggered urgent medical interventions. Mary's hand shook as she checked the reading again, hoping for an error, but the cruel red digits remained unchanged. She turned toward her oxygen concentrator, expecting to see the familiar green light that indicated normal operation, but instead found a dark, silent machine. The power cord lay unplugged beside it, coiled like a snake that had been deliberately positioned away from the wall outlet. "No," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible in the morning quiet. "No, no, no." She fumbled for the cord with trembling fingers, her vision already beginning to blur at the edges as her oxygen-starved brain struggled to process what she was seeing. The plug went into the wall socket with a satisfying click, and the concentrator hummed to life with its familiar mechanical breathing. Mary increased the flow rate and pressed the nasal cannula to her face, breathing deeply as precious oxygen flooded her system. But even as her oxygen levels slowly climbed back towards safety, a more terrible realization was taking hold. The concentrator hadn't malfunctioned. The cord hadn't worked loose on its own. Someone had deliberately unplugged her life support while she slept. The thought was so monstrous, so impossible, that Mary's first instinct was denial. It had to be an accident. David must have bumped the cord while moving equipment, knocked it loose somehow without realizing the consequences. The alternative, that her son had knowingly disconnected the machine that kept her alive, was simply too horrific to consider. But as her mind cleared with the return of oxygen, other details began to register. "Mary, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Sarah," Mary's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I need to show you something. I need someone else to see this, because I don't think I can believe it otherwise." Sarah moved quickly to Mary's side, her nurse's training evident in the way she immediately began assessing Mary's condition, checking her color, her breathing pattern, the oxygen saturation monitor that still showed the aftermath of her morning crisis. "Mary, your levels are still recovering. What happened? Did you have an episode?" "Watch," Mary said, rewinding the footage to 4:23 a.m. "Just watch." Together they sat in the small office and witnessed David's nocturnal betrayal play out on the grainy security monitor. Sarah's sharp intake of breath when David unplugged the oxygen concentrator echoed Mary's own horror, but it was the nurse's professional assessment that cut through Mary's maternal denial like a scalpel. "Mary," Sarah said quietly, her voice tight with controlled fury, "that could have killed you. If you hadn't woken up when you did. If your body hadn't triggered a natural arousal response to the oxygen deprivation." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. "He's my son," Mary whispered, as if that simple fact could somehow explain away what they had both just witnessed. "Mary." Sarah turned in her chair, grasping Mary's hands with the gentle firmness of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Your son just attempted to murder you for a power outlet. We need to call the police. Right now." The word murder hung in the air between them, stark and uncompromising. Murder. Not an accident, not a mistake, not the thoughtless action of someone lost in addiction. Murder. The deliberate ending of a human life for personal gain. Mary stared at the frozen image on the security monitor, at her son's face illuminated by the glow of his phone as he timed her suffering, and finally allowed herself to see David for what he had become. Not her little boy in need of help, but a man so consumed by his digital obsessions that he was willing to kill his own mother to feed them. The choice before her was as stark as the black and white footage on the screen. She could continue to enable and protect the son she remembered, or she could save the life of the woman she had become. For the first time since David's return, Mary had chosen herself, but the weight of that choice sat heavy in her chest as she and Sarah prepared for the conversation that would either save her life or destroy what remained of her family. The security footage still glowed on the monitor, frozen at the moment of David's ultimate betrayal, serving as undeniable evidence of a truth too monstrous for maternal love to rationalize away. "I need to talk to him first," Mary said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Before we call anyone, I need to give him a chance to explain." Sarah's expression reflected the professional skepticism of someone who had seen too many abuse victims protect their abusers. "Mary, there's no explanation for what we just watched. He deliberately unplugged your life support and stood there timing how long it would take you to. I know what I saw." Mary's interruption was sharp, edged with the desperate authority of a mother clinging to the last threads of denial. "But he's still my son. I have to at least try to understand why." The sounds from David's room had intensified as the morning progressed. Rapid clicking, electronic explosions, and his increasingly agitated voice raised an argument with invisible gaming partners. Through the thin walls, Mary could hear fragments of his commentary, complaints about lag and noobs delivered with the kind of desperate fury that suggested he was losing whatever virtual battle currently consumed his attention. Mary knocked on his door, the sound lost beneath the electronic cacophony. She knocked harder, then tried the handle. The door swung open to reveal David hunched over his primary gaming station, headphones clamped over his ears, 3 monitors displaying what appeared to be a complex military simulation. Empty energy drink cans and food containers littered every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of unwashed clothes and stale electronics. "David." Mary's voice was barely audible over the game's audio. He didn't respond, his attention completely absorbed by the virtual warfare playing out on his screens. Mary noticed his hands were shaking slightly, whether from caffeine, exhaustion, or the adrenaline of his digital battles she couldn't tell. "David!" She raised her voice, stepping into the room despite the smell and chaos. This time he heard her, spinning around in his gaming chair with the irritated expression of someone whose immersion had been violently interrupted. Up close, Mary was shocked by how much worse he looked than even a week ago. His eyes were deeply sunken, rimmed with dark circles that spoke of days without proper sleep. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and there was a tremor in his movements that suggested his body was running on stimulants and desperation. "Mom, I'm in the middle of a ranked match. This is important. More important than my life?" The words came out before Mary could stop them, carrying a weight that made David's expression shift from irritation to something approaching wariness. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mary held up the printed screenshots Sarah had helped her capture from the security footage. The grainy black and white images showed David's nocturnal activities with devastating clarity. Him unplugging her oxygen concentrator, standing beside her bed, checking his phone while she struggled to breathe. David's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: confusion, recognition, and, finally, a kind of desperate calculation as he tried to formulate a response to the undeniable evidence of his actions. "Mom, I can explain." "Explain?" Mary's voice rose, 3 weeks of accumulated fear and betrayal finally finding expression. "Explain how you unplugged the machine that keeps me alive? Explain how you stood there watching me suffocate? Explain how you timed it? It wasn't like that." David's denial came quickly, but without conviction. "I needed the outlet for my streaming setup. The tournament had a big prize pool, and if I could just—" "You needed the outlet." Mary repeated the words slowly, as if testing their weight. "You needed the outlet more than I needed to breathe." "I was going to plug it back in." David's voice cracked with desperate justification. "I was just borrowing the power for a few hours. I had it all calculated. You have that portable tank for emergencies. And I thought—" "You thought what?" "That a few hours without oxygen wouldn't hurt me. That my life support was just another appliance you could unplug whenever it was convenient." David's gaming chair creaked as he shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Mary's face and the paused game on his monitors. "You're being dramatic, Mom. It was one night, and nothing happened. You're fine." The casual dismissal of how close she'd come to dying hit Mary like a physical blow. "Fine? David, my oxygen levels dropped to 78%. I could have died. But you didn't." His response came quickly, as if her survival somehow vindicated his actions. "See? I told you it would be okay." The portable tank kicked in, just like I planned. Mary stared at her son, searching his face for any sign of remorse, any indication that he understood the magnitude of what he had done. Instead, she saw only the calculating look of someone trying to determine how much trouble he was in, and how he could minimize the consequences. "David, do you understand what you did? Do you understand that you almost killed me?" "I didn't almost kill you." His tone carried a hint of the old David, intelligent, analytical, capable of rational thought. "I did the math, Mom. Your oxygen saturation drops gradually, not all at once. I monitored your levels, and when they started getting low, I was ready to plug the concentrator back in if needed." The clinical detachment in his voice, the way he described monitoring her near suffocation like a scientific experiment, made Mary's blood run cold. This wasn't the passionate mistake of someone lost in addiction. This was the calculated risk assessment of someone who had weighed her life against his gaming needs and found her wanting. "You monitored my levels?" Mary's voice was barely a whisper. "I used an app on my phone. It can estimate oxygen saturation based on sleep patterns and movement. Very accurate, actually. I wasn't just guessing, I had data." Sarah appeared in the doorway behind Mary, her presence a reminder that this conversation had witnesses, that David's casual confession of attempted murder was being heard by someone with no maternal obligation to protect him. "David," Sarah's voice carried the authority of her medical training, "what you're describing is a calculated attempt to endanger your mother's life. You used medical knowledge to determine how long you could deprive her of life support without killing her immediately." "I wasn't trying to endanger anyone." David's defensive tone suggested he was finally beginning to understand that his actions might have serious consequences. "I was just trying to optimize our power usage. The house's electrical system is outdated, and my equipment requires consistent power to function properly." "Your equipment." Mary repeated the phrase, tasting its bitter implications. "Your gaming equipment was more important than my medical equipment." Her bedside lamp was unplugged too, its cord coiled neatly beside the concentrators. The small fan that helped her sleep comfortably had been disconnected. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of an accident. This was the systematic work of someone who had carefully chosen which devices to sacrifice. Mary heard the familiar sounds of David stirring in his room, the electronic beeps and whirs of his equipment coming to life for another day of digital immersion. Part of her wanted to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation for what surely had to be a terrible mistake. But a deeper, more frightened part of her whispered that she needed proof before making such an accusation. The security cameras. Sarah had helped her learn to operate them just yesterday. With unsteady hands, Mary made her way to the small office where the security monitor waited. Her fingers fumbled with the controls as she navigated back to the previous night's footage, her heart hammering against her ribs as she searched for the timestamp that would show her the truth. There, 3:17 a.m. The infrared camera showed her bedroom in ghostly green and white, Mary's form clearly visible under the blankets, the steady glow of her medical equipment, casting reassuring spots of light in the darkness. The oxygen concentrator's power light was clearly visible, a small green beacon confirming that her life support was functioning normally. Mary fast-forwarded, watching the timestamp blur past 3:30, 3:45, 4 o'clock. At 4:23 a.m., a figure appeared in the doorway. Mary's breath caught in her throat as she watched her son enter her bedroom, moving with the careful silence of someone who had done this before. He paused for a moment at the foot of her bed, and in the eerie green glow of the night vision camera, Mary could see him studying her sleeping form with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he moved toward the oxygen concentrator. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Please, Mary whispered to the screen, even though she knew what was coming. Please don't. But David's intentions were unmistakable. He knelt beside the machine, his movements deliberate and methodical, as he traced the power cord to the wall outlet. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt or reconsideration. He simply grasped the plug and pulled it from the wall. The concentrator's power light disappeared from the screen. Mary watched in horrified fascination as David then moved to her bedside lamp, unplugging it with the same casual efficiency. The fan followed. One by one, he systematically disconnected every electrical device in her room except for the clock radio, presumably because its glowing numbers might alert her to his presence. But the most chilling part was what happened next. Instead of leaving immediately, David remained in the room, standing beside her bed, watching her sleep. The camera captured him checking his phone, the screen's glow illuminating his face in the darkness, and Mary realized with a sick certainty that he was timing something. He was waiting to see how long it would take. The footage showed David standing there for nearly 10 minutes, occasionally glancing at his phone, watching his mother's sleeping form with the detached interest of someone conducting an experiment. Only when Mary began to shift restlessly in her sleep, her body unconsciously responding to the dropping oxygen levels, did he finally leave the room. But he didn't go far. The hallway camera picked him up moving toward the living room, where Mary could see the glow of his gaming setup casting colored light through the darkness. He had unplugged his mother's life support to power his electronics, then stayed awake to monitor the results. Mary sat staring at the screen long after the footage had moved past the crucial moments, her mind struggling to process what she had just witnessed. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of thoughtless selfishness. This was deliberate, calculated, and systematic. Her son had tried to kill her. The words formed in her mind with crystalline clarity, impossible to deny or rationalize away. David had made a conscious decision to prioritize his gaming equipment over her life, had stood in her bedroom watching her slowly suffocate, had treated her survival as a secondary concern to his digital obsessions. The sound of the front door opening made Mary's head snap up from the monitor. Sarah's voice carried down the hallway, bright with her usual Thursday morning cheer. "Mary? I brought those muffins you like, the blueberry ones from..." Sarah's voice cut off abruptly as she appeared in the office doorway, taking in Mary's ashen face and the frozen security footage still displayed on the screen. "It's not gaming equipment, Mom. It's my livelihood. This is how I make money. Streaming, tournaments, sponsorship deals. Without proper power, I can't compete at the level needed to generate income." The justification sounded rehearsed, as if David had been preparing this explanation since the moment he'd first unplugged her concentrator. But what chilled Mary most was the complete absence of any acknowledgement that her life had value beyond its impact on his gaming career. "David," Mary said quietly, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. What you did last night, what you've been doing for weeks, isn't about power optimization or income generation. You deliberately endangered my life to feed your addiction." "It's not an addiction." David's explosion of anger made both women step back. "It's my career. It's my future. And you're trying to sabotage it because you don't understand how the digital economy works." The accusation hung in the air, revealing the depth of David's disconnection from reality. In his mind, Mary's need for life-sustaining oxygen therapy was an obstacle to his gaming success, and her survival instincts were an act of sabotage against his digital aspirations. "David," Sarah said carefully, "your mother could have died. Do you understand that?" "But she didn't," David replied, as if Mary's survival somehow made his actions acceptable. "And now she's making this huge drama out of a minor power management issue." Mary felt something fundamental shift inside her as she looked at her son, this stranger, who spoke of her near death as a minor power management issue. The maternal instincts that had protected and enabled him for 34 years finally, irrevocably, broke. "Get out," she said quietly. "What? Get out of my house. Now." David's expression shifted to genuine surprise, as if the possibility of consequences for his actions had never occurred to him. "Mom, you're overreacting. We can work this out. I'll be more careful about the power management, maybe set up a better monitoring system." "You tried to kill me for a power outlet." Mary's voice was steady now, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "And you're treating it like a technical problem to be solved. Get out of my house, and don't come back." For the first time since Mary had confronted him, David seemed to grasp the seriousness of his situation. His face crumpled into an expression of panic and desperation that would have moved her just days earlier. "Mom, please, I don't have anywhere else to go. I'm broke, I'm behind on my debts. This tournament could change everything. Just give me one more chance." But Mary had already turned away, her decision made with the crystalline clarity of someone who had finally chosen survival over sentiment. Behind her, she could hear David's voice rising in increasingly desperate pleas, but the words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the protective distance of a mother who had finally stopped enabling the son who was willing to kill her for convenience. The boy she had raised was gone. The man who remained was a stranger who saw her death as acceptable collateral damage in his digital wars. And Mary, after nearly losing her life to learn that lesson, was finally ready to let him go. Mary had finally chosen survival over sentiment, but the aftermath of that choice left her feeling more vulnerable than she had since her COPD diagnosis. David's threats and complete lack of remorse had transformed her sanctuary into a battleground, and she found herself retreating to her bedroom like a refugee in her own home, afraid to sleep, afraid to trust that her life support would remain connected through the night. The sounds from David's room had changed after their confrontation. Gone were the marathon gaming sessions and electronic celebrations. Instead, Mary heard frantic phone calls conducted in hushed, desperate tones. Conversations about money, extensions, just a few more days. She caught fragments through the thin walls, pleas to creditors, arguments with what sounded like former friends, and the increasingly unhinged monologues of someone whose digital world was collapsing along with his access to the power needed to sustain it. Sarah had insisted on staying the night, bringing an overnight bag and setting up a makeshift bed in Mary's living room. Her presence provided a buffer of safety, but it also highlighted how precarious Mary's situation had become. At 67, with failing lungs and limited mobility, she was trapped in her own home with a son who had proven capable of attempted murder for the sake of convenience. "He's not going to just leave," Sarah said quietly as they sat in Mary's kitchen the next morning, speaking in the low tones of conspirators. "Men like David, addicts who've lost touch with reality. They don't respond to reasonable requests. They escalate." Mary wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, seeking warmth against the chill that seemed to have settled permanently in her bones. "What do you think he'll do?" "I don't know, but I think we need more help than just the two of us can provide." Sarah's expression carried the weight of professional experience with family crisis situations. "Mary, I think it's time to call Rebecca." The mention of her daughter's name sent a complex wave of emotions through Mary, relief at the thought of Rebecca's competent presence, shame at needing to admit the extent of David's dysfunction, and guilt at dragging her successful daughter into the family chaos she'd worked so hard to escape. "Rebecca has her own life," Mary said automatically, the response worn smooth by years of protecting her children from each other's problems. "Her career, her responsibilities. I can't ask her to." "Mary." Sarah's interruption was gentle but firm. "Your son tried to kill you. This isn't about inconvenience or family drama anymore. This is about your survival." Before Mary could respond, the sound of David's door slamming echoed through the house, followed by his footsteps moving toward the kitchen. Both women tensed as he appeared in the doorway, looking even worse than he had during their confrontation. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unwashed, and there was a manic energy in his movements that suggested he was running on desperation and stimulants. "Mom, we need to talk." His voice carried a forced calm that made Mary's skin crawl. "I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. I've been selfish, but I have a solution." Mary exchanged a look with Sarah, noting the way her friend's hand had moved closer to her phone. "What kind of solution?" "I talked to my sponsors, and they're willing to advance me money for better equipment. Professional-grade power management systems, dedicated circuits, the works. We can upgrade the whole house, so there's enough power for both your medical stuff and my streaming setup. It'll be like nothing ever happened." The proposal was delivered with the desperate enthusiasm of someone trying to negotiate his way out of consequences. But what chilled Mary was the complete absence of any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. In David's mind, the problem wasn't that he'd tried to kill his mother. It was that the house's electrical system was inadequate for his needs. "David," Sarah said carefully, "the issue isn't power management. The issue is that you deliberately unplugged your mother's life support equipment. That was just a temporary measure while I worked out the technical problems." David's response was immediate, as if he'd been rehearsing this justification. "With proper infrastructure, there wouldn't be any conflicts between her medical needs and my professional requirements." Mary stared at her son, searching for any sign of the boy she'd raised, any hint of conscience or remorse. Instead, she saw only the calculating opportunism of someone who viewed her near death as a technical challenge to be solved, rather than a moral catastrophe to be prevented. "Get out," she said quietly. "Mom, you're not listening. This is a real solution. The sponsors are serious about this. They're talking about making me a featured streamer, guaranteed income, professional support. This could set us both up for life. Get out of my house." David's forced calm began to crack, revealing the desperate fury beneath. "You're being unreasonable. I'm offering to fix everything, to make this better than it was before, and you're acting like I'm some kind of monster. You tried to kill me." The words came out flat, final, carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I did not try to kill you." David's explosion of rage made both women recoil. "I made a calculated risk assessment based on available data. There's a huge difference between attempted murder and power optimization." The casual way he described monitoring her suffocation as power optimization drove home the depth of his disconnection from reality. Mary realized with crystalline clarity that she was no longer dealing with her son. She was dealing with a stranger who happened to share David's face and memories, but none of his humanity. "Sarah," Mary said without taking her eyes off David. "Call Rebecca. Call her now." "Mom, don't." David's voice took on a pleading quality that might have moved her weeks earlier. "Rebecca doesn't understand the gaming industry. She'll just make everything worse. We can handle this ourselves." But Sarah was already dialing, her nurse's training evident in the calm efficiency with which she handled the crisis. Mary could hear the phone ringing through the speaker, then Rebecca's familiar voice, professional and slightly impatient. "Sarah, is everything okay? Mom doesn't usually." "Rebecca, I'm with your mother, and we need you to come home. There's been an incident with David." The change in Rebecca's tone was immediate, shifting from busy professional to concerned daughter in an instant. "What kind of incident? Is Mom hurt?" Mary took the phone with trembling hands, the weight of admitting her failure as a mother almost too much to bear. "Rebecca, honey, I need you to come home. David's been—" The words stuck in her throat, too monstrous to speak aloud. "Mom, what's wrong? You're scaring me." "He unplugged my oxygen concentrator while I was sleeping. He could have killed me." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice carried a coldness that Mary had never heard from her daughter before. "I'll be there tonight." "Rebecca, you don't have to." "I'll be there tonight." The finality in Rebecca's tone brooked no argument. "And Mom, don't let David leave before I arrive. We need to deal with this properly." After Rebecca hung up, the kitchen fell into a tense silence, broken only by the hum of Mary's oxygen concentrator and the distant sounds of David moving around the house with increasingly agitated energy. Mary could hear him making more phone calls, his voice rising in frustration as whatever support system he'd been trying to mobilize apparently failed to materialize. Dr. Wright arrived an hour later, summoned by Sarah's professional concern for Mary's deteriorating condition. His examination was thorough and troubling, revealing elevated stress markers and declining lung function that spoke to the toll of living in constant fear. "Mary, this level of physiological stress could be fatal," Dr. Wright said with the blunt honesty that had made him her trusted physician. "Your body is already working at capacity, adding the stress of feeling unsafe in your own home." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. As the afternoon wore on, a support network began to form around Mary. Sarah maintaining her protective vigil, Dr. Wright documenting the medical impact of David's actions, and the promise of Rebecca's arrival, providing a lifeline to family members who still prioritized her survival over their own convenience. But through it all, David continued his increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate his way back into Mary's good graces, offering elaborate technical solutions to what he stubbornly refused to acknowledge as a moral problem. Each proposal revealed more clearly how completely he had lost touch with reality, how thoroughly his addiction had consumed not just his judgment but his basic humanity. By evening, as they waited for Rebecca's arrival, Mary understood with painful clarity that the choice she'd made, survival over sentiment, was not a single decision, but an ongoing commitment. David would not leave willingly, would not accept consequences gracefully, and would continue to see her life as negotiable collateral in his digital obsessions. The boy she had raised was gone. The man who remained was a stranger whose presence in her home was quite literally a matter of life and death. And for the first time in 34 years of motherhood, Mary was ready to choose her own life over her child's wants. For the first time in 34 years of motherhood, Mary was ready to choose her own life over her child's wants. But the arrival of Rebecca that evening transformed her private family crisis into something that demanded official intervention. Rebecca had driven straight through from Atlanta, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled from 6 hours of furious highway travel, her face set in the grim expression of someone who had spent the journey preparing for battle. The reunion between siblings was immediate and explosive. Rebecca found David in the living room, surrounded by his gaming equipment like a fortress of electronics, still making desperate phone calls to invisible sponsors and creditors. When she walked through the front door, her professional confidence intact despite her travel-worn appearance, David looked up from his screens with the wary expression of someone who recognized a threat to his carefully constructed justifications. "Rebecca." His greeting was cautious, testing. "Mom said you were coming, but I didn't think." "Stand up." Rebecca's voice carried the executive authority she'd honed through years of corporate management, cutting through David's attempted pleasantries like a blade. "Stand up and look at me." David remained seated, his hands hovering over his keyboard as if his gaming equipment could somehow protect him from his sister's judgment. "Look, I know Mom's been dramatic about the power situation, but I can explain. You tried to kill our mother." The words came out flat, final, carrying no room for negotiation or rationalization. "I've seen the security footage. I've talked to Dr. Wright. I know exactly what you did." For the first time since Rebecca's arrival, David seemed to grasp that his usual manipulation tactics wouldn't work on someone who had spent years cutting through corporate deception and excuses. He stood slowly, his addiction-ravaged appearance even more shocking when contrasted with Rebecca's polished professionalism. "It wasn't like that," he began, but Rebecca was already moving toward Mary's office where the security monitor waited. "Sarah, show him," Rebecca said without taking her eyes off David. "Show him what we watched. Make him see himself." The three of them, David, Rebecca, and Mary, stood in the small office watching the nighttime footage that had shattered Mary's last illusions about her son. On the grainy black and white screen, David's betrayal played out with devastating clarity. The deliberate unplugging of Mary's life support, the calculated timing, the clinical monitoring of her suffering. David watched himself commit attempted murder with a detachment that chilled everyone in the room. His face showed no shame, no horror at seeing his own actions, only the calculating expression of someone trying to determine how much trouble he was in and how he could minimize the consequences. "This is evidence of elder abuse and attempted murder," Rebecca said quietly. "Criminal charges, prison time, a felony record that will follow you for the rest of your life. You're overreacting." David's response was automatic, but his voice lacked conviction. "It was one night, and nothing happened. Mom's fine." "Mom almost died." Rebecca's control cracked slightly, revealing the fury beneath her professional facade. "Her oxygen levels dropped to life-threatening levels because you decided your gaming was more important than her survival." "It's not gaming, it's my career. It's an addiction." Rebecca's interruption was sharp, final. "And you're so deep in denial that you nearly committed matricide for a power outlet." Mary watched her children face each other across the divide of addiction and reality, seeing clearly for the first time how completely David had become a stranger to both of them. Rebecca's presence provided a reality check that made David's justifications sound even more hollow, his disconnection from consequence even more complete. "We're calling the police," Rebecca announced, pulling out her phone with the decisive motion of someone who had already made all the necessary decisions. "This stops now." "Rebecca, wait." Mary's voice was barely a whisper, the lifetime habit of protecting her children warring with her survival instincts. "Maybe we should try to get him help first. Treatment, rehabilitation." "Mom." Rebecca turned to face her mother, her expression gentle but implacable. "He tried to kill you. This isn't a family problem anymore. This is a criminal matter." David's panic was immediate and visceral. "You can't call the police. I don't have anywhere else to go. My debts, my sponsors. This will ruin everything I've worked for." "You ruined it yourself," Rebecca said, already dialing, "when you decided Mom's life was worth less than your gaming setup." Officer Linda Martinez arrived within 20 minutes, her professional demeanor immediately establishing the gravity of the situation. She was a compact woman in her early 40s, with the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with domestic violence and elder abuse cases. Her presence transformed Mary's living room from a family dispute into an official crime scene. "Mrs. Feldington," Officer Martinez said, settling into the chair across from Mary with practiced ease, "I understand there's been an incident involving your son and your medical equipment." Mary found herself telling the story with surprising clarity. David's return home, the escalating power issues, the discovery of the unplugged concentrator, and finally the security footage that proved his intent. Officer Martinez took notes with methodical precision, asking clarifying questions that revealed her extensive experience with similar cases. "And you have video evidence of this incident?" Officer Martinez asked. "Yes," Sarah replied, gesturing toward the office. "Multiple cameras, multiple incidents. This wasn't a one-time occurrence." Officer Martinez spent nearly an hour reviewing the security footage, her expression growing grimmer with each piece of evidence. The video showed not just the night Mary had discovered, but a pattern of David prioritizing his electronic needs over his mother's medical requirements, unplugging her equipment, monitoring her distress, timing her recovery. "Mr. Feldington," Officer Martinez said when she'd finished her review, "I need to speak with you about what I've seen in this footage." David's interview revealed the full extent of his disconnection from reality. When confronted with video evidence of his actions, he showed no remorse, only irritation at being interrupted in his gaming schedule. His explanations, technical justifications about power optimization and risk assessment, sounded increasingly unhinged when delivered to a law enforcement officer investigating attempted murder. "So you're telling me," Officer Martinez said with professional patience, "that you calculated how long you could deprive your mother of life-supporting oxygen without killing her, and you consider this acceptable behavior?" "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," David insisted. "I was solving a technical problem. The house's electrical system couldn't support both her medical equipment and my professional setup, so I had to find a way to optimize power distribution by unplugging her oxygen concentrator while she slept. Temporarily. I was monitoring her levels the whole time." Officer Martinez exchanged a look with Rebecca that spoke to years of experience with perpetrators who couldn't understand why their victims considered near-death experiences traumatic. Dr. Wright's medical testimony proved crucial in establishing the severity of David's actions. His clinical assessment of Mary's condition, both the immediate danger she'd faced and the ongoing health impact of living in constant fear, provided the legal framework needed to pursue serious charges. "Mrs. Feldington's COPD puts her in an extremely vulnerable position," Dr. Wright explained to Officer Martinez. "Interrupting her oxygen therapy even briefly could trigger respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, or death." What her son describes as, quote, "temporary optimization" was actually a potentially fatal medical emergency. When Officer Martinez finally placed David under arrest, his reaction revealed how completely he had lost touch with consequence and accountability. He seemed genuinely surprised that his actions constituted a crime, as if the legal system should accommodate his gaming schedule rather than protect his mother's right to survival. "This is ridiculous," he protested as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I didn't hurt anyone. She's fine. This is just a power management issue blown out of proportion." But as Officer Martinez read him his rights, elder abuse, reckless endangerment, assault, David's digital fortress finally crumbled. The gaming equipment that had been more important than his mother's life sat silent and dark, abandoned electronics that would never again justify attempted murder. Mary watched her son being led away in handcuffs, feeling a complex mixture of grief and relief. The boy she had raised was gone, had been gone for longer than she'd wanted to admit. The man who remained was a stranger, whose addiction had consumed not just his judgment, but his basic humanity. For the first time in weeks, Mary's house felt truly quiet. No electronic warfare, no desperate phone calls, no sound of someone calculating her life's value in kilowatts and gaming tournaments. The silence was profound, peaceful, and finally safe. The oxygen concentrator hummed beside her chair, its steady rhythm no longer threatened by someone who saw her survival as negotiable. Mary closed her eyes and breathed deeply, tasting freedom for the first time since David's return. The freedom to sleep without fear, to trust that her life support would remain connected, to choose her own survival over her child's wants without guilt or apology. Justice had finally arrived, carrying handcuffs and the promise that some betrayals were too profound for maternal love to excuse. For the first time since David's return, Mary could breathe freely, not just because her oxygen levels were stable, but because she'd finally learned the difference between loving someone and letting them destroy you. But that hard-won peace would be tested in the most public and painful way possible, as David's trial transformed her private family tragedy into a courtroom spectacle that would force her to relive her son's betrayal before strangers, cameras, and the unforgiving scrutiny of the legal system. The Richmond County Courthouse buzzed with an unusual energy on the morning of October 15th. Word had leaked about the case. A son accused of attempting to murder his elderly mother by unplugging her life support to charge his gaming equipment. And the story had captured the morbid fascination of a public increasingly concerned about digital addiction and elder abuse. Local news vans lined the street outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes reaching toward gray autumn skies like electronic flowers seeking signal instead of sunlight. Mary sat in Rebecca's car in the courthouse parking lot, watching reporters set up their equipment with the efficiency of scavengers preparing for a feast. Her oxygen concentrator hummed quietly in the back seat, a portable reminder of her vulnerability that she would carry into the courtroom like evidence of her own mortality. "We don't have to do this," Rebecca said for the dozenth time that morning, her executive confidence clearly shaken by the media attention. "We could still accept a plea deal. Keep this private." "No." Mary's voice was steadier than she felt. "He needs to face the consequences of what he did, and other families need to know that this can happen, that addiction can make someone capable of this." Sarah squeezed Mary's hand from the passenger seat, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm of publicity and legal proceedings. "You're doing the right thing. You're not just testifying for yourself. You're testifying for every elderly person whose family members see them as inconvenient rather than human." The courthouse interior was a maze of marble corridors and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Mary's small entourage, Rebecca, Sarah, Dr. Wright, and Officer Martinez, moved through the crowds of attorneys, defendants, and family members, like a protective formation around a wounded queen. Mary's oxygen concentrator wheels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor, a steady percussion that announced her presence and her vulnerability to anyone who cared to notice. Courtroom 3B felt simultaneously too large and too small for the drama about to unfold. The gallery was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and a surprising number of elderly people who had apparently come to witness justice for one of their own. At the defense table, David sat beside his attorney, looking nothing like the gaming-obsessed addict who had nearly killed his mother. Someone had cleaned him up, pressed suit, trimmed hair, the kind of superficial transformation that courtrooms demanded but that couldn't disguise the hollow look in his eyes or the nervous tremor in his hands. Judge Patricia Hawkins called the court to order with the no-nonsense authority of someone who had presided over family dysfunction for 20 years. She was a compact woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her expression as she reviewed the case files. "The Commonwealth of Virginia versus David Feldington," Judge Hawkins announced. "Charges of elder abuse in the first degree, reckless endangerment, and assault. How does the defendant plead?" David's attorney, a nervous-looking man named Richard Caldwell, stood with visible reluctance. "Not guilty, Your Honor. My client suffers from severe digital addiction disorder, which compromised his judgment and decision-making capabilities." Mary felt a chill at the defense strategy becoming clear. David would claim his addiction made him not responsible for his actions, as if being consumed by gaming somehow excused attempted murder. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Angela Torres, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s who had built her career on elder abuse cases. Her opening statement was methodical and devastating, laying out the evidence with clinical precision, while never losing sight of the human cost of David's actions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Torres began, "this case is about a choice made by a 34-year-old man who decided that his gaming equipment was more important than his 67-year-old mother's life. The evidence will show that David Feldington deliberately and repeatedly unplugged his mother's life-supporting oxygen concentrator to power his electronics, monitored her suffering with scientific detachment, and showed no remorse when confronted with the near-fatal consequences of his actions." Torres clicked through a presentation that transformed Mary's home into a crime scene, showing the jury photographs of the extension cord snaking through hallways, the displaced medical equipment, the gaming setup that had taken priority over life support. Each image was a piece of evidence in a puzzle that spelled out attempted murder with electronic components. "The defendant will claim that addiction made him not responsible for his choices," Torres continued. "But addiction doesn't turn someone into a sociopath. Addiction doesn't erase the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, between acceptable risk and attempted murder. The evidence will show that David Feldington knew exactly what he was doing, calculated the risks to his mother's life, and decided those risks were acceptable as long as his gaming needs were met." The defense's opening statement attempted to paint David as a victim of circumstance and mental illness. Caldwell spoke earnestly about digital addiction as a recognized psychological disorder, about the neurochemical changes that gaming could produce in vulnerable individuals, about David's genuine inability to control his compulsive behaviors. David Feldington is not a monster, Caldwell argued. He's a sick man whose addiction overwhelmed his judgment and his capacity for normal human empathy. The actions he took were not the calculated decisions of a would-be murderer. They were the desperate, irrational choices of someone whose brain chemistry had been hijacked by an addiction as powerful and destructive as any drug. Mary listened to her son being described as both victim and perpetrator, watching the jury's faces for any sign of how they were processing these competing narratives. She saw skepticism, curiosity, and occasional flashes of what might have been recognition, parents thinking about their own children's relationship with technology, perhaps wondering where normal use ended and dangerous obsession began. The prosecution's case unfolded with methodical precision over 3 days. Officer Martinez testified about the crime scene, the evidence of systematic power theft, and David's complete lack of remorse during questioning. Her professional demeanor and obvious experience with similar cases lent weight to her assessment that David's actions represented calculated endangerment rather than impulsive mistakes. Dr. Wright's testimony proved particularly damaging to the defense. His clinical explanation of COPD and oxygen therapy made clear the life-and-death nature of Mary's medical needs, while his documentation of her deteriorating health during David's stay established the direct link between stress and survival. Interrupting oxygen therapy for a COPD patient is not a minor inconvenience, Dr. Wright explained to the jury. It's a potentially fatal medical emergency. Mrs. Feldington's oxygen saturation dropped to levels that could have triggered cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, or death. The defendants claim that this was temporary optimization is like But it was the security footage that provided the most compelling evidence. The courtroom fell silent as the grainy black and white images played on large screens, showing David's nocturnal activities with devastating clarity. The jury watched him unplug Mary's oxygen concentrator, monitor her distress, time her suffering, all with the detached efficiency of someone conducting a scientific experiment. Mary had to leave the courtroom during this portion of the testimony. Even months later, watching her son's betrayal play out on screen was too much to bear. Rebecca and Sarah flanked her in the hallway as she struggled to control her breathing, her portable oxygen tank providing the support that David had been willing to sacrifice for his gaming needs. When Mary finally took the stand, the courtroom was absolutely silent. Her appearance, frail but determined, wheeling her oxygen concentrator to the witness box like a prop in her own survival story, provided a visual reminder of her vulnerability that no amount of legal argument could counter. Torres's questioning was gentle but thorough, allowing Mary to tell her story in her own words. She spoke about David's return home, the escalating power issues, her growing fear and confusion as her health deteriorated. Her voice was steady as she described discovering the unplugged concentrator, the security footage that revealed the truth, the confrontation that shattered her last illusions about her son. Mrs. Feldington, Torres asked, when you saw the security footage of your son unplugging your oxygen concentrator while you slept, what went through your mind? Mary was quiet for a long moment, looking directly at David for the first time since the trial began. He sat with his head down, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes. I realized that the son I raised was gone, Mary said quietly. The boy who used to bring me flowers from the garden, who read me stories when I was sick, that child had been replaced by a stranger who saw my life as negotiable. I understood that I had to choose between enabling his addiction and surviving it. The cross-examination was brutal. Caldwell attempted to paint Mary as an overbearing mother who had enabled David's dysfunction, suggesting that her sudden decision to involve authorities was more about control than safety. He questioned her memory, her interpretation of events, her motivations for pressing charges against her own son. Mrs. Feldington, isn't it true that you threatened to cut off David's financial support unless he reduced his gaming activities? I never threatened anything, Mary replied firmly. I asked him to respect my medical needs and the safety requirements of my equipment. But you admit that you wanted him to stop gaming? I wanted him to stop unplugging my life support. Mary's response was sharp, cutting through Caldwell's attempts at misdirection. I wanted to sleep without wondering if I would wake up dead, because my son needed another power outlet. The defendant's testimony was the most challenging part of the trial for Mary to witness. David took the stand in his press suit and clean haircut, looking nothing like the addicted stranger who had nearly killed her. His attorney had clearly coached him extensively, and his responses were measured, remorseful, and completely unconvincing. "I never intended to hurt my mother," David testified, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine emotion. "I was sick, consumed by an addiction I didn't understand and couldn't control. The decisions I made were not the decisions of a rational person. They were the desperate choices of someone whose brain chemistry had been altered by compulsive gaming." But under cross-examination, David's facade crumbled. Torres systematically dismantled his claims of impaired judgment, pointing out the calculated nature of his actions, his ability to monitor Mary's condition, his sophisticated understanding of power distribution and medical equipment. "Mr. Feldington, you testified that your addiction impaired your judgment, but you were able to calculate exactly how long you could deprive your mother of oxygen without killing her immediately, weren't you?" I was trying to minimize the risk." "You were managing the risk of killing your mother to maximize your gaming time, correct?" "It wasn't like that. You used an app on your phone to monitor her oxygen levels while she suffocated, didn't you?" "I was being careful." "Careful not to kill her too quickly, you mean?" David's breakdown on the witness stand was complete and devastating. His careful composure dissolved into the desperate justifications Mary remembered from their final confrontation. Technical explanations about power optimization, complaints about the house's electrical limitations, and the chilling assertion that his gaming career was more important than her medical needs. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges, Mary felt not triumph, but a profound sadness. The boy she had raised was truly gone, replaced by this stranger, who would now face the consequences of choosing digital obsession over human decency. Judge Hawkins sentenced David to 8 years in prison with mandatory addiction treatment, calling his actions a calculated betrayal of the most fundamental bonds of family and humanity. As the bailiff led David away in handcuffs, he looked back at Mary one final time, his expression unreadable behind the mask of someone who had lost everything to an addiction he'd never learned to control. Mary wheeled her oxygen concentrator out of the courthouse into the autumn afternoon, surrounded by reporters shouting questions and cameras recording her every breath. But for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt truly free, not just from David's immediate threat, but from the burden of protecting someone who had been willing to kill her for convenience. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Mary had learned to serve herself, to choose survival over enabling, truth over denial, and her own life over the bottomless need of someone who saw her death as acceptable collateral damage in his digital wars. For the first time since David's return, Mary could breathe freely, not just because her oxygen levels were stable, but because she'd finally learned the difference between loving someone and letting them destroy you. But that hard-won peace would be tested in the most public and painful way possible, as David's trial transformed her private family tragedy into a courtroom spectacle that would force her to relive her son's betrayal before strangers, cameras, and the unforgiving scrutiny of the legal system. The Richmond County Courthouse buzzed with an unusual energy on the morning of October 15th. Word had leaked about the case. A son accused of attempting to murder his elderly mother by unplugging her life support to charge his gaming equipment. And the story had captured the morbid fascination of a public increasingly concerned about digital addiction and elder abuse. Local news vans lined the street outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes reaching toward gray autumn skies like electronic flowers seeking signal instead of sunlight. Mary sat in Rebecca's car in the courthouse parking lot, watching reporters set up their equipment with the efficiency of scavengers preparing for a feast. Her oxygen concentrator hummed quietly in the back seat, a portable reminder of her vulnerability that she would carry into the courtroom like evidence of her own mortality. The machine that had once been a target for David's power optimization calculations now served as a symbol of her right to exist safely, her right to breathe without fear that someone else would decide her life was less important than their digital entertainment. "We don't have to do this," Rebecca said for the dozenth time that morning, her executive confidence clearly shaken by the media attention. "We could still accept a plea deal. Keep this private." "No." Mary's voice was steadier than she felt, carrying the weight of months of healing and the hard-won wisdom that had taught her to choose survival over sentiment. "He needs to face the consequences of what he did. And other families need to know that this can happen, that addiction can make someone capable of this." Sarah squeezed Mary's hand from the passenger seat, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm of publicity and legal proceedings. "You're doing the right thing. You're not just testifying for yourself. You're testifying for every elderly person whose family members see them as inconvenient rather than human." The courthouse interior was a maze of marble corridors and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Mary's small entourage, Rebecca, Sarah, Dr. Wright, and Officer Martinez, moved through the crowds of attorneys, defendants, and family members like a protective formation around a wounded queen. Mary's oxygen concentrator wheels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor, a steady percussion that announced her presence and her vulnerability to anyone who cared to notice. The sound drew curious glances from other courthouse visitors, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the elderly woman whose medical equipment suggested the gravity of whatever case had brought her here. Mary had grown accustomed to these looks over the months since David's arrest, learning to see them not as signs of pity but as reminders that her story mattered, that her survival had meaning beyond her own healing. Courtroom 3B felt simultaneously too large and too small for the drama about to unfold. The gallery was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and a surprising number of elderly people who had apparently come to witness justice for one of their own. At the defense table, David sat beside his attorney, looking nothing like the gaming-obsessed addict who had nearly killed his mother. Someone had cleaned him up, pressed suit, trimmed hair, the kind of superficial transformation that courtrooms demanded but that couldn't disguise the hollow look in his eyes or the nervous tremor in his hands. Mary studied her son from across the courtroom, noting how prison had changed him. He was thinner, paler, his skin bearing the grayish cast of someone who spent time under fluorescent lights rather than natural sunlight. But more disturbing than his physical appearance was the way he held himself, hunched slightly forward, eyes downcast, the posture of someone who had learned to make himself small in dangerous spaces. For a moment, Mary felt a familiar surge of maternal protectiveness, the instinct to shield her child from harm that had nearly cost her life. But then she remembered the security footage, the image of David standing over her bed timing her suffocation, and the protective impulse faded. The person sitting at the defense table was not her little boy in need of protection. He was a man who had made calculated decisions to endanger her life for his own convenience. Judge Patricia Hawkins called the court to order, with the no-nonsense authority of someone who had presided over family dysfunction for 20 years. She was a compact woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her expression as she reviewed the case files. Her reputation for fairness was legendary in legal circles, but so was her intolerance for defendants who tried to excuse serious crimes with claims of addiction or mental illness. "The Commonwealth of Virginia versus David Feldington," Judge Hawkins announced, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "Charges of elder abuse in the first degree, reckless endangerment, and assault. How does the defendant plead?" David's attorney, a nervous-looking man named Richard Caldwell, stood with visible reluctance. He was young, probably handling his first high-profile case, and the media attention had clearly rattled him. "Not guilty, Your Honor. My client suffers from severe digital addiction disorder, which compromised his judgment and decision-making capabilities." Mary felt a chill at the defense strategy becoming clear. David would claim his addiction made him not responsible for his actions, as if being consumed by gaming somehow excused attempted murder. She had researched similar cases during the months leading up to the trial, learning that addiction defenses were becoming increasingly common as technology-related crimes grew more frequent. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Angela Torres, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s who had built her career on elder abuse cases. Her reputation for thoroughness was matched only by her passion for protecting vulnerable populations, and she had spent months preparing for this trial with the intensity of someone who took the case personally. Her opening statement was methodical and devastating, laying out the evidence with clinical precision, while never losing sight of the human cost of David's actions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Torres began, moving with confident strides that commanded attention. "This case is about a choice. A choice made by a 34-year-old man who decided that his gaming equipment was more important than his 67-year-old mother's life. The evidence will show that David Feldington deliberately and repeatedly unplugged his mother's life-supporting oxygen concentrator to power his electronics, monitored her suffering with scientific detachment, and showed no remorse when confronted with the near-fatal consequences of his actions." Torres clicked through a presentation that transformed Mary's home into a crime scene, showing the jury photographs of the extension cord snaking through hallways, the displaced medical equipment, the gaming setup that had taken priority over life support. Each image was a piece of evidence in a puzzle that spelled out attempted murder with electronic components. The jurors leaned forward, studying the photos with the fascination of people trying to understand how a home could become a battleground between medical necessity and digital obsession. The defendant will claim that addiction made him not responsible for his choices, Torres continued, her voice taking on the prosecutorial edge that had made her feared in legal circles. But addiction doesn't turn someone into a sociopath. Addiction doesn't erase the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, between acceptable risk and attempted murder. The evidence will show that David Feldington knew exactly what he was doing, calculated the risks to his mother's life, and decided those risks were acceptable as long as his gaming needs were met. Torres displayed a timeline of David's behavior, showing the escalation from minor power disruptions to systematic endangerment of Mary's medical equipment. The pattern was clear and chilling, each incident more serious than the last, each rationalization more elaborate, each risk to Mary's life more calculated and deliberate. You will hear testimony from medical experts about the life and death nature of oxygen therapy for COPD patients, Torres explained. You will see security footage that documents the defendant's actions with disturbing clarity. And you will hear from Mrs. Feldington herself about what it feels like to wake up suffocating because your own son has decided your death is an acceptable price for his digital entertainment. The defense's opening statement attempted to paint David as a victim of circumstance and mental illness. Caldwell spoke earnestly about digital addiction as a recognized psychological disorder, about the neurochemical changes that gaming could produce in vulnerable individuals, about David's genuine inability to control his compulsive behaviors. His presentation included brain scans showing addiction patterns, expert opinions about diminished capacity, and testimonials from addiction specialists about the overwhelming nature of digital dependencies. David Feldington is not a monster, Caldwell argued, his voice carrying the desperate sincerity of someone trying to humanize the inhuman. He's a sick man whose addiction overwhelmed his judgment and his capacity for normal human empathy. The actions he took were not the calculated decisions of a would-be murderer. They were the desperate, irrational choices of someone whose brain chemistry had been hijacked by an addiction as powerful and destructive as any drug. Caldwell presented David's history, the gradual slide from casual gaming to compulsive behavior, the job loss that triggered his return home, the mounting financial pressures that exacerbated his desperation. He painted a picture of a man trapped by circumstances beyond his control, driven to increasingly desperate measures by an addiction he couldn't understand or overcome. Mary listened to her son being described as both victim and perpetrator, watching the jury's faces for any sign of how they were processing these competing narratives. She saw skepticism, curiosity, and occasional flashes of what might have been recognition. Parents thinking about their own children's relationship with technology, perhaps wondering where normal use ended and dangerous obsession began. The prosecution's case unfolded with methodical precision over 4 days. Officer Martinez testified about the crime scene investigation, the evidence of systematic power theft, and David's complete lack of remorse during questioning. Her professional demeanor and obvious experience with similar cases lent weight to her assessment that David's actions represented calculated endangerment rather than impulsive mistakes. In my 15 years investigating domestic violence and elder abuse cases, Officer Martinez explained to the jury, I've learned to distinguish between crimes of passion and crimes of calculation. Mr. Feldington's actions were not impulsive responses to immediate pressures. They were systematic, planned, and carried out with full knowledge of their potential consequences. Under cross-examination, Caldwell attempted to paint the police investigation as biased against addicts, suggesting that Officer Martinez's experience with domestic violence had made her predisposed to see criminal intent, where medical professionals might see compulsive behavior. But Martinez's responses were measured and professional, her years of courtroom testimony evident in the way she deflected attempts to undermine her credibility. Dr. Wright's testimony proved particularly damaging to the defense. His clinical explanation of COPD and oxygen therapy made clear the life and death nature of Mary's medical needs, while his documentation of her deteriorating health during David's stay established the direct link between stress and survival. He had brought charts, graphs, and medical imaging that showed the progression of Mary's condition, the correlation between her stress levels and her respiratory function. Interrupting oxygen therapy for a COPD patient is not a minor inconvenience, Dr. Wright explained to the jury with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades treating respiratory diseases. It's a potentially fatal medical emergency. Mrs. Feldington's oxygen saturation dropped to levels that could have triggered cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, or death. The defendants claim that this was, quote, temporary optimization is like calling Russian roulette, quote, temporary bullet management. Dr. Wright's testimony included a detailed explanation of how oxygen concentrators work, why they must remain continuously powered, and what happens to COPD patients when their therapy is interrupted. He showed the jury Mary's medical records from the morning she discovered her unplugged concentrator, the dangerously low oxygen readings that could have been fatal if she hadn't awakened when she did. Under cross-examination, Caldwell attempted to suggest that Mary's condition wasn't as serious as claimed, that the portable oxygen tank provided adequate backup protection, that David's risk assessment might have been medically sound. But Dr. Wright's responses were devastating to the defense, his expertise making clear that any interruption of Mary's oxygen therapy was potentially fatal, regardless of backup systems or monitoring apps. But it was the security footage that provided the most compelling evidence. The courtroom fell silent as the grainy black and white images played on large screens, showing David's nocturnal activities with devastating clarity. The jury watched him unplug Mary's oxygen concentrator, monitor her distress, time her suffering, all with the detached efficiency of someone conducting a scientific experiment. The footage was presented chronologically, showing the pattern of David's behavior over several weeks. The first incidents showed him unplugging minor appliances, lamps, fans, charging devices. But as his gaming needs intensified, the targets became more serious. The humidifier that helped Mary breathe, the refrigerator that kept her medications cold, and finally, the oxygen concentrator itself. Mary had to leave the courtroom during this portion of the testimony. Even months later, watching her son's betrayal play out on screen was too much to bear. Rebecca and Sarah flanked her in the hallway as she struggled to control her breathing, her portable oxygen tank providing the support that David had been willing to sacrifice for his gaming needs. The hardest part, Mary told Sarah while they waited in the hallway, is seeing how calculated it was. I kept hoping it was impulse, desperation, something that happened in a moment of poor judgment. But watching him stand there timing my suffering. That's what makes it attempted murder rather than reckless endangerment, Sarah replied gently. The premeditation, the calculation, the complete disregard for your humanity. When Mary finally took the stand, the courtroom was absolutely silent. Her appearance, frail but determined, wheeling her oxygen concentrator to the witness box like a prop in her own survival story, provided a visual reminder of her vulnerability that no amount of legal argument could counter. The bailiff helped her position the concentrator beside the witness chair, its quiet hum audible in the hushed courtroom. Torres's questioning was gentle but thorough, allowing Mary to tell her story in her own words. She spoke about David's return home, the escalating power issues, her growing fear and confusion as her health deteriorated. Her voice was steady as she described discovering the unplugged concentrator, the security footage that revealed the truth, the confrontation that shattered her last illusions about her son. Mrs. Feldington, Torres asked, when you first discovered your oxygen concentrator had been unplugged, what was your initial reaction? Confusion, Mary replied, her voice clear despite the emotion underlying her words. I thought there must have been a power outage, or maybe I had accidentally kicked the cord. It never occurred to me that someone had deliberately disconnected my life support. And when you realized it had been done intentionally, I still couldn't believe David would do such a thing. I thought maybe he had bumped it while moving his equipment, didn't realize what he had done. Even after I saw the security footage, part of me kept looking for explanations that would make it an accident. Torres guided Mary through the timeline of events, the discovery of the security system, the decision to review the footage. When they reached the moment of revelation, watching David deliberately unplug her concentrator, Mary's composure briefly cracked. When you saw the security footage of your son unplugging your oxygen concentrator while you slept, what went through your mind? Mary was quiet for a long moment, looking directly at David for the first time since the trial began. He sat with his head down, unable or unwilling to meet her eyes, his shoulders hunched in the posture of someone trying to disappear. I realized that the son I raised was gone, Mary said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. The boy who used to bring me flowers from the garden, who read me stories when I was sick, that child had been replaced by a stranger who saw my life as negotiable. I understood that I had to choose between enabling his addiction and surviving it. The cross-examination was brutal. Caldwell attempted to paint Mary as an overbearing mother who had enabled David's dysfunction, suggesting that her sudden decision to involve authorities was more about control than safety. He questioned her memory, her interpretation of events, her motivations for pressing charges against her own son. Mrs. Feldington, isn't it true that you had been pressuring David to find employment and reduce his gaming activities? I had expressed concern about his lack of work and his excessive gaming, yes. But my primary concern was always his well-being, not controlling his behavior. But you admit that you wanted him to change his lifestyle? I wanted him to be healthy and self-sufficient. I wanted him to be the person I knew he could be. And when he didn't change according to your expectations, you threatened to involve authorities? Mary's response was sharp, cutting through Caldwell's attempts at misdirection. I involved authorities when I discovered he was trying to kill me. I wanted him to stop unplugging my life support, not change his lifestyle. I wanted to sleep without wondering if I would wake up dead because my son needed another power outlet. Caldwell persisted in his attempts to portray Mary as controlling and vindictive, suggesting that her decision to prosecute was motivated by anger rather than genuine fear for her safety. But Mary's responses remained consistent and credible, her obvious frailty, and the presence of her oxygen concentrator, serving as constant reminders of her vulnerability. The defendant's testimony was the most challenging part of the trial for Mary to witness. David took the stand in his pressed suit and clean haircut, looking nothing like the addicted stranger who had nearly killed her. His attorney had clearly coached him extensively, and his responses were measured, remorseful, and completely unconvincing to anyone who had seen the security footage. I never intended to hurt my mother, David testified, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine emotion. I was sick, consumed by an addiction I didn't understand and couldn't control. The decisions I made were not the decisions of a rational person. They were the desperate choices of someone whose brain chemistry had been altered by compulsive gaming. David's testimony followed the defense strategy closely. He portrayed himself as a victim of his addiction, someone whose judgment had been so compromised by digital dependencies that he couldn't distinguish between right and wrong. He spoke about the mounting pressures, the financial desperation, the overwhelming compulsion to maintain his gaming activities regardless of consequences. But under cross-examination, David's facade crumbled. Torres systematically dismantled his claims of impaired judgment, pointing out the calculated nature of his actions, his ability to monitor Mary's condition, his sophisticated understanding of power distribution and medical equipment. Mr. Feldington, you testified that your addiction impaired your judgment, but you were able to calculate exactly how long you could deprive your mother of oxygen without killing her immediately, weren't you? I was trying to minimize the risk. You were managing the risk of killing your mother to maximize your gaming time, correct? It wasn't like that. You used an app on your phone to monitor her oxygen levels while she suffocated, didn't you? I was being careful. Careful not to kill her too quickly, you mean? Torres pressed relentlessly, forcing David to confront the calculation and premeditation behind his actions. Each question revealed more clearly how his claims of impaired judgment were contradicted by the sophisticated planning and monitoring he had employed. David's breakdown on the witness stand was complete and devastating. His careful composure dissolved into the desperate justifications Mary remembered from their final confrontation. Technical explanations about power optimization, complaints about the house's electrical limitations, and the chilling assertion that his gaming career was more important than her medical needs. Mr. Feldington, do you understand that your mother could have died? But she didn't die, David replied with the same callous dismissal that had characterized their final confrontation. I monitored the situation. I had contingency plans. Contingency plans that involved letting your mother suffocate? I wasn't going to let her die. I just needed the power for my equipment. The jury's reaction to David's testimony was visible: disgust, disbelief, and in some cases, genuine horror at his complete lack of empathy for his mother's suffering. His words revealed the depth of his disconnect from reality, his inability to see Mary as anything more than an obstacle to his gaming needs. Expert witnesses for both sides provided competing interpretations of David's psychological state and capacity for judgment. The defense presented addiction specialists who testified about the neurological impacts of gaming addiction, the way compulsive behaviors could override normal decision-making processes. But the prosecution's experts countered with testimony about the calculated nature of David's actions, the sophisticated planning required for his systematic endangerment of Mary's life. The closing arguments crystallized the competing narratives that had defined the trial. Torres painted David as a calculating predator who had made conscious choices to endanger his mother's life for his own convenience. She reminded the jury of the security footage, the systematic pattern of escalation, the complete absence of remorse even when confronted with evidence of his actions. This is not a case about addiction overcoming judgment, Torres argued in her closing. This is a case about a man who chose his gaming equipment over his mother's life, who calculated the risks and decided they were acceptable, who stood in her bedroom timing how long it would take her to suffocate. Addiction may explain why David Feldington lost his job, why he moved back home, why he needed power for his gaming equipment. But addiction does not explain attempted murder. Caldwell's closing argument portrayed David as a victim of forces beyond his control, someone whose addiction had hijacked his brain chemistry and eliminated his capacity for normal human empathy. He reminded the jury of the expert testimony about gaming addiction, the neurological evidence of impaired judgment, the desperate circumstances that had driven David to increasingly irrational behavior. David Feldington is not a monster, Caldwell pleaded. He's a sick man who lost control of his life to an addiction that consumed his judgment, his empathy, his basic humanity. The man who unplugged his mother's oxygen concentrator is not the same person sitting before you today. He was someone whose brain had been hijacked by an addiction as powerful and destructive as any drug. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, a relatively short time for such a complex case. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges, elder abuse in the first degree, reckless endangerment, and assault, Mary felt not triumph but a profound sadness. The boy she had raised was truly gone, replaced by this stranger, who would now face the consequences of choosing digital obsession over human decency. Judge Hawkins's sentencing hearing was held a week later. She listened to impact statements from Mary, Rebecca, Dr. Wright, and Sarah, each one painting a picture of the devastation David's actions had caused, not just to Mary, but to everyone who cared about her. The defense presented letters from prison addiction counselors, evidence of David's participation in treatment programs, pleas for leniency based on his mental health struggles. But Judge Hawkins was unmoved by claims that addiction excused attempted murder. "Mr. Feldington," she said, looking directly at David as she pronounced sentence, "you made a calculated decision to endanger your mother's life for your own convenience. You monitored her suffering with scientific detachment and showed no remorse when confronted with the near-fatal consequences of your actions. This court sentences you to 8 years in prison with mandatory addiction treatment, not because we believe treatment will cure you, but because society deserves protection from someone who would kill his own mother for a power outlet." As the bailiff led David away in handcuffs, he looked back at Mary one final time, his expression unreadable, behind the mask of someone who had lost everything to an addiction he'd never learned to control. Mary met his gaze for a moment, seeing in his eyes not the son she had raised but the stranger, who had been willing to kill her for convenience. Mary wheeled her oxygen concentrator out of the courthouse into the autumn afternoon, surrounded by reporters shouting questions and cameras recording her every breath. But for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt truly free, not just from David's immediate threat, but from the burden of protecting someone who had been willing to kill her for convenience. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Mary had learned to serve herself, to choose survival over enabling, truth over denial, and her own life over the bottomless need of someone who saw her death as acceptable collateral damage in his digital wars. The trial was over, but her real work, healing, advocacy, and helping other families avoid the nightmare she had survived, was just beginning. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Mary had learned to serve herself, to choose survival over enabling, truth over denial, and her own life over the bottomless need of someone who saw her death as acceptable collateral damage in his digital wars. 6 months after the trial's conclusion, Mary Feldington sat in the Richmond Community Center's main auditorium, looking out at an audience of 43 people who had come to hear her speak about elder abuse and digital addiction. The transformation was remarkable. Where once stood a woman diminished by fear and the weight of enabling a dangerous addiction, now sat someone who had found her voice through survival. Mary's oxygen concentrator hummed quietly beside the podium, no longer a symbol of vulnerability but a testament to her right to exist safely in her own home. Her speech, titled "When Love Becomes Enabling, A Mother's Journey from Victim to Advocate," had become a cornerstone presentation for elder abuse awareness programs throughout Virginia. 6 months ago, I almost died because my son needed to charge his gaming laptop, Mary began, her voice carrying clearly through the small microphone clipped to her cardigan. I'm not here today to villainize addiction, or to condemn families struggling with loved ones who have lost themselves to digital obsessions. I'm here to tell you that love, real love, sometimes requires saying no to behavior that threatens your survival. In the front row, Rebecca sat with Sarah, both women now permanent fixtures in Mary's support network. Rebecca had made the difficult decision to relocate her marketing consultancy from Atlanta to Richmond, renting a house 3 miles from Mary's home. The move had initially been presented as temporary, a way to help Mary recover from the trauma of David's betrayal. But both women had discovered something neither had expected. They genuinely enjoyed each other's company. I spent 34 years protecting my son from the consequences of his choices, Mary continued, her gaze moving across faces that showed varying degrees of recognition, pain, and hope. I told myself it was maternal love, but what I was really doing was enabling behavior that grew more dangerous over time. I was so focused on protecting him from the world that I forgot to protect myself from him. The audience included social workers, family members dealing with digital addiction, elderly individuals who had experienced various forms of abuse, and healthcare professionals seeking to understand the intersection of technology and elder vulnerability. Mary had learned to read her audiences over the months, identifying the parents whose children's gaming had become concerning, the adult children struggling with aging parents, the professionals who worked with both populations. Dr. Wright sat near the back, his presence both professional and personal. Mary's health had improved dramatically since David's removal from her home and subsequent incarceration. Her lung function had stabilized, her stress markers had normalized, and most importantly, her oxygen saturation readings had consistently remained in safe ranges. The correlation between feeling safe in her own home and her physical well-being had become a case study he now used in his own presentations about the health impacts of domestic stress on COPD patients. The security cameras that caught my son's actions were originally installed to make me feel safer from external threats, Mary explained, clicking to a slide that showed the layout of her home's security system. I never imagined the greatest danger would come from inside my own family. But those cameras didn't just document attempted murder. They documented a pattern of escalating disregard for my humanity that I had been rationalizing and excusing for years. The presentation included carefully edited portions of the security footage, sanitized of the most disturbing elements, but clear enough to demonstrate the systematic nature of David's behavior. Mary had struggled with the decision to make these images public, but her therapist had helped her understand that her story could potentially save other lives, prevent other families from reaching the crisis point that had nearly cost Mary everything. Technology saved my life in 2 ways, Mary said as the footage played on the screen behind her. My oxygen concentrator literally keeps me breathing, and my security system provided the evidence needed to protect me from someone who saw that breathing as optional. But technology also nearly killed me, because someone I loved had become so addicted to digital stimulation that my death was an acceptable price for his gaming convenience. After her presentation, Mary held a question-and-answer session that had become the most impactful part of her speaking engagements. The questions revealed the universality of the struggles she'd faced: families torn apart by digital addiction, elderly people afraid to seek help because their abusers were their own children, healthcare workers trying to identify signs of elder abuse in technology-dependent households. Mrs. Feldington, asked a woman in her 50s, whose voice shook with emotion. My son is 42 and has been living with me for 3 years since his divorce. He games constantly, and I've noticed my electric bill has tripled. Last week, I found my diabetes medication had spoiled because my refrigerator had been unplugged. He says it was an accident, but after hearing your story, Mary recognized the pattern immediately. The gradual escalation, the medical equipment treated as secondary to gaming needs, the mother's instinct to excuse and rationalize. Trust your instincts, Mary replied gently. Document everything. Take pictures of unplugged equipment. Keep copies of utility bills. And most importantly, remember that your medical needs are not negotiable. Your son's gaming addiction is his responsibility to manage, not yours to accommodate. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes, and Mary saw herself 6 months earlier, desperate for someone to tell her that she had the right to prioritize her own survival over her child's wants. After the event, Mary's small group retired to her favorite restaurant for what had become their traditional post-presentation dinner. The conversation was lighter now, focused on upcoming speaking engagements, Rebecca's business expansion, and Sarah's promotion to head nurse at the regional medical center. These dinners had become treasured routine, a reminder that life after trauma could be not just livable, but genuinely fulfilling. The response to your presentations keeps growing, Rebecca noted, reviewing the feedback forms that attendees had filled out. The community center is getting requests from other cities, other states even. There's talk of creating a documentary about your story. Mary considered this while sipping her coffee, a luxury she could now enjoy without calculating whether someone might unplug the coffee maker to power their gaming equipment. I never wanted to become a public figure, she said thoughtfully, but if sharing what happened to me can prevent other families from reaching that crisis point. You're saving lives, Sarah said simply, not just the lives of potential victims, but the lives of addicts who might never recover if they cross the line from selfishness to attempted murder. David can never come back from what he did, but other people's sons and daughters might be reached before they get to that point. That evening, Mary returned to her transformed home with a sense of peace that still felt miraculous after months of experiencing it. Rebecca had helped her redecorate, removing any traces of David's electronic fortress and creating spaces that served Mary's needs rather than accommodating someone else's digital obsessions. The living room had been restored to its original purpose. Comfortable seating arranged for conversation, bookshelves filled with the novels Mary had abandoned during the months of fear, plants that thrived now that they weren't being unplugged to make room for gaming equipment. The security system still operated, but its purpose had evolved. Instead of documenting threats, it now provided the peace of mind that allowed Mary to sleep soundly. She still reviewed the footage occasionally, but now she saw only the quiet rhythms of a safe home. Her oxygen concentrator running steadily through the night, her medical equipment functioning without interference, her own movements through rooms that belonged entirely to her. The mail that evening brought an unexpected development, a letter from the Virginia Department of Corrections with David's inmate number in the return address. Mary stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, her therapist's words echoing in her memory. "You have no obligation to maintain contact with someone who tried to kill you, even if that person is your son." The letter was handwritten on prison stationery, David's familiar handwriting looking smaller and more careful than she remembered. "Mom, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. I've been in prison for 6 months now, and I've been in mandatory addiction counseling for 4 of those months. I'm not writing to ask for anything, or to make excuses for what I did. I'm writing to tell you that I finally understand what I did to you. Not the technical aspects. I always understood those. I finally understand that I tried to kill my own mother for a power outlet. I understand that I stood in your bedroom timing how long it would take you to suffocate. I understand that I treated your life as less important than my gaming schedule. The counselor here says that true recovery requires acknowledging the full weight of your actions, without minimization or justification. I tried to murder you, Mom. I don't know how to live with that knowledge, but I'm trying to learn. I know there's no forgiveness for what I did. I know that our relationship is over, and that it should be over, but I needed you to know that the person who did those things to you is not the person I want to be, and I'm working every day to make sure I never become that person again. I hope you're breathing easily. I hope you're safe. I hope you found peace." Mary read the letter 3 times, her emotions cycling through anger, sadness, and something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but might have been the beginning of understanding. The person who had written this letter sounded more like the son she had raised than the stranger who had tried to kill her, but Mary had learned hard lessons about the difference between momentary clarity and lasting change. She carried the letter to her office and placed it in a file folder marked David Legal Documents. She wouldn't respond immediately, if ever, but she would keep it, not as absolution for his crimes, but as evidence that recovery was possible, even for someone who had lost their humanity so completely that they could calculate their mother's death in kilowatts and gaming hours. The next morning brought a phone call that would mark another milestone in Mary's transformation from victim to advocate. The caller was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a researcher from the University of Richmond studying the intersection of digital addiction and elder abuse. "Mrs. Feldenton, I've been following your advocacy work, and I wondered if you might be interested in participating in a research study. We're documenting cases like yours to better understand how technology addiction can escalate to life-threatening behavior toward vulnerable family members." Mary found herself saying yes, recognizing that her story could contribute to broader understanding of these issues. The interview process would be extensive, involving detailed documentation of the timeline of David's behavior, analysis of the security footage, and psychological assessment of the family dynamics that had enabled the situation to escalate. "We're particularly interested in the enablement patterns," Dr. Walsh explained during their first meeting. "How families rationalize increasingly dangerous behavior, and what interventions might be effective before the situation becomes life-threatening." The research process proved both challenging and healing for Mary. Reconstructing the timeline of David's escalating behavior forced her to confront how many warning signs she had minimized or excused, but it also helped her understand that her responses had been normal maternal reactions to abnormal circumstances. "You couldn't have predicted that gaming addiction would lead to attempted murder," Dr. Walsh assured her during one of their sessions. "But your experience can help us identify the warning signs that other families should watch for." Mary's participation in the research led to her involvement in developing educational materials for healthcare providers, social workers, and families dealing with digital addiction. Her story became a case study in multiple university programs, her security footage, with her permission, became training material for elder abuse investigators, and her advocacy work expanded to include consultation with other families facing similar crises. "I never wanted this to be my purpose," Mary told Rebecca during one of their weekly dinners. "I wanted to be a grandmother, maybe travel a little, enjoy my retirement. I never wanted to become the poster child for elder abuse prevention." "But you're good at it," Rebecca replied, "and you're making a difference. The feedback from your presentations shows that people are recognizing warning signs in their own families, getting help before situations become dangerous." 6 months after the trial, Mary received notification that David had been accepted into a specialized addiction treatment program within the prison system. The program was experimental, combining traditional addiction counseling with therapy specifically designed for individuals whose addictions had led to violent or criminal behavior. Mary's first instinct was relief. Perhaps her son could be helped. Perhaps he could recover some semblance of his humanity. But her second instinct was more complex. David's recovery was his responsibility, not hers. She had spent 34 years trying to save him from himself, and that effort had nearly cost her life. Whatever healing David might achieve in prison, it would have to happen without her participation, without her emotional investment, without her hope serving as fuel for his recovery process. The realization felt like the final step in her own healing, the recognition that she could wish David well without needing to be involved in his recovery, that maternal love could include the wisdom to step back and allow consequences to do their work. A year after David's trial, Mary stood before the Virginia State Legislature's Committee on Elder Affairs, testifying in support of legislation that would mandate training on digital addiction recognition for healthcare workers serving elderly populations. Her oxygen concentrator hummed quietly beside the witness table, a reminder of the vulnerability that had made her such an effective advocate for others facing similar threats. "Honorable committee members," Mary began, "I am here today not just as a survivor of elder abuse, but as someone who has learned that love without boundaries becomes enabling, and enabling without limits becomes life-threatening. The legislation before you today could save lives by ensuring that healthcare workers can recognize when technology addiction in families has become dangerous to elderly patients." The legislation passed, becoming known informally as Mary's Law, though Mary herself had lobbied for less personal terminology. The law required healthcare providers serving elderly populations to receive training on recognizing signs of technology-related elder abuse, established protocols for reporting suspicious patterns of medical equipment interference, and created funding for support services for elderly individuals whose family members showed signs of dangerous digital addiction. 2 years after the trial, Mary's speaking engagements had expanded internationally. She traveled to conferences in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, sharing her story with audiences who faced similar challenges with technology addiction and elder vulnerability. The travel was exhausting for someone with COPD, but Mary had learned to manage her condition while maintaining an active advocacy schedule. "I sometimes wonder if David's addiction was partly my fault," Mary confided to her therapist during a routine session. "If I had set firmer boundaries earlier, if I had recognized the warning signs." "Mary," her therapist replied gently, "you are not responsible for David's choices. You are responsible for your own choices. And you chose to survive. You chose to seek help. You chose to share your story to help others. Those are the choices that define you, not the choices David made." The therapy sessions had become less frequent as Mary's healing progressed, but they remained an important part of her maintenance routine. Surviving attempted murder by one's own child required ongoing professional support, and Mary had learned to prioritize her mental health with the same diligence she applied to her physical medical needs. 3 years after the trial, Mary received word that David was eligible for parole. The notification came with an opportunity for her to provide a victim impact statement to the parole board, either in writing or in person. Mary spent weeks considering her response, finally deciding to submit a written statement that focused not on punishment, but on the ongoing impact of David's actions on her life and her work. To the parole board, "My name is Mary Feldenton, and I am the victim of David Feldenton's attempted murder. I am writing not to advocate for or against his release, but to ensure the board understands the full impact of his actions. David's attempt to kill me by unplugging my life support equipment was not an impulsive act born of momentary desperation. It was the culmination of months of escalating behavior in which he systematically prioritized his gaming needs over my medical requirements. He calculated the risks to my life and decided they were acceptable costs for his digital entertainment. The physical impact of his actions was severe, dangerously low oxygen levels that could have triggered cardiac arrest or death. But the psychological impact has been equally significant. I live with the knowledge that someone I raised and loved was willing to kill me for convenience. That knowledge changes how you move through the world, how you trust, how you understand the bonds of family. However, I want the board to know that David's actions also led to something positive. My survival and advocacy work have helped other families recognize dangerous patterns before they become life-threatening. My story has contributed to research, legislation, and educational programs that may prevent other elderly individuals from facing what I faced. If David is released, I hope he continues the recovery work he has begun in prison. I hope he finds ways to contribute positively to society and to make amends for the harm he has caused. But I want the board to understand that his recovery must happen without my participation. I have learned that survival sometimes requires letting go of people you love, even when they are your own children. Whatever decision you make regarding David's parole, I will continue my advocacy work. I will continue sharing my story with families struggling with digital addiction, with healthcare workers learning to recognize elder abuse, with anyone who needs to hear that choosing your own survival over someone else's destructive behavior is not selfish. It is necessary. Respectfully, Mary Feldenton *. David's parole was denied. Mary felt neither satisfaction nor disappointment at the news, only a quiet acknowledgement that justice had its own timeline, separate from her healing process. Her work continued, her advocacy expanded, and her life remained full of purpose and meaning that had nothing to do with her son's incarceration or recovery. On the 4th anniversary of David's arrest, Mary sat in her garden, breathing easily in the afternoon sunshine, while her oxygen concentrator hummed quietly nearby. Rebecca was visiting, working on her laptop at the patio table, while Sarah tended to the tomato plants they had planted together that spring. The scene was peaceful, domestic, and filled with the kind of simple contentment that Mary had never expected to experience again. "I've been thinking about writing a book," Mary said, surprising herself with the announcement. Rebecca looked up from her laptop, intrigued. "About your experience, about recovery from family trauma, about learning to choose yourself when the people you love become dangerous to your survival. Not just my story, but stories from other people I've met through my advocacy work." Sarah paused in her gardening, wiping dirt from her hands as she considered the idea. "You have stories from your presentations, don't you? People who've shared their experiences with you?" "Dozens of them," Mary confirmed. "And not just elder abuse. Adult children who've had to cut contact with addicted parents. Siblings who've had to choose their safety over family loyalty. Spouses who've learned that love sometimes requires saying no to destructive behavior." The book project gave Mary a new focus for her advocacy work, a way to expand her reach beyond speaking engagements and research participation. Working with a ghostwriter and an editor who specialized in trauma narratives, Mary began documenting not just her own story, but the stories of others who had faced similar impossible choices between family loyalty and self-preservation. "The common thread," Mary explained to her editor during one of their working sessions, "is the moment when people realize that love without boundaries becomes enabling, and enabling without limits becomes dangerous. Everyone I've interviewed has that moment of recognition, that choice between continuing to protect someone who's harming them or choosing their own survival." The book, eventually titled When Love Becomes Dangerous, Choosing Survival Over Sentiment, became a resource for families, healthcare workers, and social service professionals dealing with the intersection of addiction and abuse. Mary's story anchored the collection, but the book's power came from the recognition that her experience was not unique, that across the country, families were struggling with similar impossible choices between love and survival. 5 years after David's trial, Mary received a second letter from prison. This one was different, longer, more detailed, and accompanied by documentation of David's participation in addiction recovery programs, his completion of a bachelor's degree in psychology, and his work as a peer counselor for other inmates struggling with digital addiction. "Mom, I know my last letter was probably too little too late, and I understand if you never responded because there was nothing to say. I'm writing again not because I expect or want a response, but because my recovery work has taught me that amends require action, not just words. I have spent 5 years in therapy, education, and service work, trying to understand how I became someone who could treat your life as negotiable. I know now that my addiction was not an excuse for attempted murder. It was an explanation for how I lost the ability to see you as human, rather than as an obstacle to my gaming needs. I want you to know that I have become a peer counselor for inmates whose addictions led to violence against family members. I share my story, our story, with men who have hurt the people they claim to love. I tell them about standing in your bedroom timing how long it would take you to suffocate. I tell them about the app I used to monitor your oxygen levels while you struggled to breathe. I tell them about the look on your face when you realized your son had tried to kill you. I do this work not to earn forgiveness or to feel better about what I did. I do it because maybe someone will hear my story and step back before they cross the line I crossed. Maybe someone will choose to get help before their addiction turns them into someone who sees their mother's death as acceptable collateral damage. I know you've become an advocate for elder abuse prevention. I know you speak at conferences and work with researchers, and have helped pass legislation to protect people like you from people like me. I want you to know that I'm proud of the work you're doing, and I'm glad you survived not just my attempt to kill you, but the years of stress and fear I put you through before that final night. I will never ask for your forgiveness, because what I did is unforgivable. I will never ask to see you, because I have no right to your presence, or your time, or your emotional energy. But I will continue doing this work, trying to prevent other families from reaching the point we reached, trying to honor your survival by making sure other mothers don't have to make the choice between enabling and surviving. I hope you're still breathing easily. I hope you're still safe. I hope you've found peace and purpose in your survival. David P.S. I read about your book in the prison library. I haven't read it. I don't think I'm ready for that yet. But I'm glad you found a way to turn what happened to you into something that helps other people. Mary read this letter multiple times over several days, noting the differences from David's first letter. This one contained no requests, no expectations, no appeals for contact or forgiveness. It was simply an accounting of work being done. A report from someone trying to find meaning in the wreckage of his choices. She filed this letter with the first one, still not ready to respond but no longer afraid of the contact. David's recovery, if it was genuine, was his work to do. Mary's work was helping other families, other victims, other people who needed to learn that choosing survival over sentiment was not betrayal but wisdom. On the 5th anniversary of David's arrest, Mary stood before the International Conference on Elder Abuse, delivering a keynote address to an audience of 800 healthcare professionals, researchers, and advocates. Her oxygen concentrator hummed quietly beside the podium, no longer a symbol of vulnerability but a testament to the right of all people to exist safely in their own homes. 5 years ago, Mary began, I almost died because my son needed to charge his gaming laptop. Today, I stand before you not as a victim of that attempted murder, but as someone who learned that survival requires more than just breathing. It requires the courage to choose yourself when the people you love become dangerous to your existence. The standing ovation that followed her presentation was not just for her words, but for her transformation from victim to advocate, from enabler to survivor, from someone who nearly died protecting her son, to someone who lived by choosing herself. In the quiet of her hotel room that night, Mary reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The boy she had raised was gone, lost to an addiction that had consumed his humanity along with her safety. The man in prison was trying to find his way back to something resembling human decency. But that work was his to do, not hers to supervise or support. Mary's work was with the living, the families who could still be helped, the victims who could still be saved, the healthcare workers who could still be trained to recognize the warning signs she had missed. Her work was with her own life, her own recovery, her own continued healing from the trauma of learning that love without boundaries becomes enabling, and enabling without limits becomes life-threatening. The oxygen concentrator hummed quietly in the corner of the hotel room, a steady reminder of her medical needs and her right to have those needs respected. 5 years earlier, that machine had been unplugged by someone who saw her survival as less important than his gaming convenience. Tonight, it ran uninterrupted, powering the continued life of someone who had learned that choosing survival over sentiment was not selfishness, but wisdom. Mary closed her eyes and breathed deeply, tasting the freedom that came from finally understanding the difference between loving someone and letting them destroy you. Tomorrow would bring new speaking engagements, new families to help, new opportunities to turn her survival into service for others who faced similar impossible choices. But tonight, she simply breathed, grateful for each steady inhalation and exhalation, grateful for the machine that supported her life, and grateful for the hard-won wisdom that had taught her to choose her own survival over someone else's destructive needs. The cord that had once bound her to enabling behavior had been cut, replaced by the stronger bonds of self-respect, boundaries, and the recognition that true love sometimes required the courage to say no to those who would harm you. In the quiet darkness, with only the gentle hum of her life support for company, Mary Felden continued the work of living, breathing easily, sleeping safely, and using her survival to help others learn that they too had the right to choose their own lives over the bottomless needs of those who would consume them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote.